Eric Wilson is not only the first Vikings free agent the Commanders should go after, he might be the most important one of all.
You are Locked On Commanders, your daily podcast on the Washington Commanders. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, the #1 sports podcast network. And I'm David Harrison, your guy on the ground, credentialed member of the media covering the Washington Commanders for WUSA 9, also writing for Commanders on SI, here with you 5 days a week on the program. And on today's episode, we are hunting Minnesota Vikings. While every roster has its back-end players, there are also those who got away or just couldn't be pinned down because they're already trapped where they are. But first, the two Minnesota Vikings the Commanders have to go after now that Daronte Jones has arrived to be the team's new defensive coordinator. All of that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And it's all brought to you today by FanDuel. It's the last call for football on FanDuel. And if you're a new customer, bet just $5, you get $200 in bonus bets if that bet wins. Linebacker Eric Wilson. I already told everydayers that he should be the first Vikings free agent the Washington Commanders target this offseason, but he also might be the most important. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, he is over the age of 30. And yes, I understand Commanders fans, you are just desperate for this Washington Commanders team to get younger. And trust me, Adam Peters has said that this team is going to get younger. That is something that they also understand they need to do. However, that does not mean that every single player that this team brings on in the offseason has to be a spring chicken. It's okay to bring in veterans. It's okay to bring in some guys that are even over the age of 30 because they can serve very, very important roles. And that is why Eric Wilson is a #1 free agent. Not because he's got 10, 15 years of longevity ahead of him. Not because I even expect him to be playing for the Washington Commanders when the new stadium opens in 2030. But if possibly Daronte Jones is a successful defensive coordinator, potentially he'll be getting a head coaching job before the new stadium opens if it's ultimately successful. But if it's eventually successful, Eric Wilson could potentially be part of the reason that success at least begins to get built upon Daronte Jones's arrival, because what he can do is unlock the scheme, unlock the system, unlock the language to the rest of the team. And there is a clear hole right now on the 2026 roster for Mike linebacker. Even if Jordan McGee is your penciled in starting Mike linebacker for the Washington Commanders, behind him as a Mike linebacker, a true Mike linebacker, you basically just have Ale Cajo, who is an undrafted free agent last year out of UCLA, made the active roster for the initial cuts, all those types of things. But certainly we have not seen things out of Ale Cajo on the field right now that would say, boom, he is your locked in backup #2 Mike linebacker. No need to go get anybody else. Now, Bobby Wagner could certainly still come back. That's certainly true. But the thing about Eric Wilson is he appeared in 90+% of the Minnesota Vikings plays in 2025, replaced Blake Cashman as the Mike linebacker after he was injured in week 1 for a time period. Blake eventually came back, but Eric Wilson never left the field. 115 tackles, 6.5 sacks in 2025. And he did that because he could play Mike, but he could also play another linebacker position. That versatility is what's incredibly important. Another thing that's incredibly important is having a man who not only knows Daronte Jones' system, or at least where it's coming from, the language that's coming from, but also is willing to do basically whatever the team needs him to do. When he originally signed back to play with the Minnesota Vikings in 2025, he signed as a projected backup. He was a culture driver. He was a glue guy. He was a leader in the locker room, coach on the field type of guy who was going to play a role. That is what he was doing. That's the stage of his career that he was in. If the Washington Commanders need him to come in and do that again and not necessarily start at Mike linebacker, not necessarily play Mike linebacker at all, he might play one of the other 2 linebacker spots. And of course, those things can flip depending on formations and alignments and all that other stuff. So I'm not going to pin him down to Will or to Sam or anything like that. But bottom line is he's versatile. He can play multiple spots. He's intelligent. He's a veteran. He's a leader. He's a known leader. And he can help, again, this defense get on track faster than if you don't have him. Then you don't have that translator, that kind of computer memory type of system or situation going on with a veteran on the field. Now, certainly if Bobby Wagner comes back, like, is Bobby fully able to learn Daronte Jones' system and all that? Of course he is. But this is a guy, Eric Wilson, who isn't just capable of learning it. He's already learned it. He can help teach it, and he can help make the unit better. So yes, he's a little bit older. But again, go watch him actually play. Like, the man can still move, the man can still play, even though he is 32 years old, or will be 32 years old. So to me, the Minnesota Vikings got to go after him. You have to go pursue him, and I think they're going to get him. The cost is probably going to be about 2 years, $12 to $14 million contract. You're talking $6 to $7 million annual average value, which is a bump than what he got when he signed with the Minnesota Vikings. But that kind of play and that kind of performance is going to earn you that kind of a bump. And you don't have to trade for him. That's probably the best part, because the team doesn't have a whole lot of draft capital. So as far as getting younger and as far as building the roster through the draft, you can still do that because you have your draft capital in place, and you don't have to worry about this being a guy unless you promise him that he's going to be the starter, which I don't see this front office doing for him any more than they've ever done for anybody else. If he ends up in a role player role, he's going to be fine with that. He's going to do what the team needs him to do. So he is the number one target for me for this Minnesota Vikings pending free agency class in 2026. Now that Daronte Jones has arrived, the number two target might strike you just a little bit weird. It's wide receiver Jalen Nailor. That is my number two Minnesota Vikings target. And yes, it has to do with Daronte Jones coming over to the Washington Commanders. Jalen Nailor, if you don't know who he is, he's a high upside wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, the type of guy that I think Adam Peters is going to really be attracted to, and the kind of guy that I think could really help David Blau's first year as an offensive coordinator. We know that the Washington Commanders need a number 2 receiver. Right now, pending on the current roster, you've got Terry McLaurin, you got Luke McCaffrey, you got Jalen Lane, and you don't have a whole bunch else. Deebo Samuel is a pending free agent. Whether or not he comes back is obviously a big part of this. But if Jalen Nailor wants to go out there and try to find himself an opportunity to prove that he's a number 2 receiver, he's probably not going to be able to do it in Minnesota, buried behind 2 other receivers that are obviously just a little bit at least more established. One really more established, very much more established, and the other just a little bit at least. Jalen Nailor, best part about him, he played slot and he played the outside. He played about 50-50 in each. Most of his targets and catches and yards did come from the slot, but he does have the ability to play both. And he's got the athletic profile that Adam Peters loves. Had an 8.09 RAS score, which was high, good athleticism score, elite explosion grade from his RAS. And he did run a 4.5 40 at the combine, even though his nickname is Speedy, but he plays a lot faster. Turn on the tape. Jalen Nailor plays a lot faster than a 4.5 receiver. Career highs in 2025, 29 catches, 444 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Came into the NFL from Michigan State with some durability issues. However, he has played in 15 or more games in 3 of his 4 seasons, including 17 games in both 2024 and 2025. So what does this have to do with Daronte Jones? Well, quite frankly, Daronte Jones has been having his unit, his secondary, his pass defense that he was the coordinator of Minnesota, practicing against Jalen Nailor for these last few seasons, so he can vouch for his work ethic, he can vouch for his presence in the building, and he can vouch for his ability as a receiver, as someone who was out there tasked to defend him. So if he does give that vote of confidence to Adam Peters, to Dan Quinn, then I think the Washington Commanders should absolutely go after Jalen Nailor in free agency. And I think they're probably pretty likely to get him because, again, Jalen, if he wants to go out there and be a number 2, probably eventually wants to be a number 1 even. But if he wants to get that opportunity to climb from number 3 in Minnesota to number 2 somewhere else, it's probably a pretty good spot to do it in Washington, especially if Deebo Samuel doesn't come back. But even if Deebo comes back, remember, like the quote unquote number 2 traditional, you're talking just the second outside receiver, was not supposed to be Deebo last year. It was supposed to be Noah Brown. So again, the Washington Commanders could be looking for that second outside receiver, which we can call number 2 for the sake of conversation. You're looking at about 2 years, $10 to $12 million contract, $5 to $6 million annual average value. If you go that route, that's about what his market value is looking at right now. So that's 2 guys that we're talking about, but there are some other names we have to discuss so that we can dismiss them, especially because I've already seen Commanders fans predicting that the Washington Commanders are going to pursue defensive lineman Jalen Redmond. And I hate to break it to you, but it's just not happening. That and more coming up on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Commanders is brought to you in part by TurboTax. Tax season doesn't have to take over your life this year. TurboTax is making it easier than ever to just hand things off and move on with your day. With TurboTax full service, you can have your taxes done for you by a trusted local expert, start to finish, without the stress or the guesswork. Instead of spending hours trying to figure out those forms, You can meet with a local TurboTax expert in person or connect online, and they'll take care of everything from W-2s to self-employment forms, and they'll work to get you every deduction possible. You can upload your documents, go about your day, and get updates right in the TurboTax app. It is a huge time saver and gives you real peace of mind knowing that an expert is on top of your taxes. For a limited time, you can have your taxes done by a local TurboTax expert for just $150 all in if a TurboTax expert didn't file for you last year. Just filed by February 28th. Take taxes off your plate. Get back to your life. Visit TurboTax.com/local to book your appointment today. Today's episode of Locked On Commanders also brought to you in part by FanDuel. It's the last call for football on FanDuel. One final Sunday, one last kickoff, the final chance to get in on the action before the NFL season officially comes to a close. It is time for Super Bowl 60, and FanDuel is making sure you're right in the middle of it with a special offer just in time for the biggest game of the year. Whether you're backing the favorite, riding with the underdog, or building one last same-game parlay, this is the game everybody's been waiting for. This is where predictions turn into plays, stats turn into storylines, and every snap just feels a little bit bigger. It's the perfect way to cap off the season and make the Super Bowl even more exciting from kickoff to final whistle. If you're a new customer, bet just $5. You get $200 in bonus bets if that $5 bet wins. Again, new customers to FanDuel, bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. Make it count, because after the Super Bowl, the season is over. Last call for football on FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of Super Bowl 60. Thank you for making Locked On Commanders your first listen of the day, every day, to the Everydayers. Those of you come through for every single episode. A special thank you to you for coming through for yet another one here today. And thanks to all of you for making Locked On the number one sports podcast network around. If you haven't already, please go check out the Everydayer Club, LockedOnCommanders.supercast.com, to check out the Everydayer Club. 2 tiers, that membership tier and all access tier. The all access tier has everything in membership tier, plus just a little bit more. So again, LockedOnCommanders.supercast.com to check out the Everydayer Club today. The Washington Commanders are not going to be pursuing defensive lineman Jalen Redmond in free agency, and if it was available on FanDuel as a futures bet, I would absolutely be putting money on it. And it has nothing to do with how good I think Jalen Redmond has been or could be, because I think the fact of the matter is he's definitely an ascending defensive lineman. And I totally get why at least some Washington Commanders fans have been beating up the message boards and comment sections and social media feeds saying the Washington Commanders got to go after Jalen Redmond because he could be a breakout star. In 2025, 6 sacks, which is very, very high for an interior defensive lineman. 33 plus tackles in 2025, ranked very highly amongst all D tackles and a lot of productions and grades and stats and ratings and all that kind of stuff. Was a very high use core rotation player for the Minnesota Vikings defense in 2025. So that shows you that the coaching staff in Minnesota definitely trusted him and what he was doing on the field. But here's the problem. He's an exclusive rights free agent, which means that the Minnesota Vikings can offer him a league minimum contract, which is going to be worth just about a little around or over $1 million. And he's not allowed to negotiate with any other team. He's not allowed to go talk to anybody else. No GMs are allowed to call his agent or him or anything like that. Not even to do anything for any other type of compensation. The only thing they could do is potentially the Minnesota Vikings could sign him to that cheap price and then try to trade him. But sign and trades don't happen in the NFL because they happen in other leagues, because they're a mechanism of salary cap management. The NFL doesn't have that mechanism in salary cap management. The true market value, I did the research on this, and if you look at a D lineman of Jalen Redmond's age, he's about 27, 28 years old. With the production that he's had, you're looking at about an $8 to $12 million annual average value. That's $8 to $12 million per year on a new contract that he would probably fetch on the open market. And the Minnesota Vikings have the opportunity to lock him down for $1 million for the next year. Now, they could also go out there and extend him. They could actually give him a bigger contract. But typically, when a team has an exclusive rights free agent opportunity, that's what they do. That's what they take. $25 to $35 million on the market or $1.1 million for 1 year. Which one would you choose if you're an NFL general manager? So should the Washington Commanders be interested in Jalen Redmond? 1,000%. The problem is he's never going to come available. He's never going to be available for the Washington Commanders to be interested in. So, as much as I love Jalen, as much as I know some of you love Jalen, the Minnesota Vikings also love Jalen, and he's not going anywhere. Next up is Ivan Pace Jr., linebacker. He's kind of the blueprint for the anywhere, can come from anywhere type of blitzer, very much like a Frankie Louvu type. Was used as a high volume starter by the Minnesota Vikings and alongside Eric Wilson on that lineup. He is a restricted free agent. So he's another player that I know some Commanders fans have been really interested in. He's restricted, which is not the same as exclusive rights free agent. It's not as restricting as an exclusive rights free agent, but the expectation is that the Minnesota Vikings will offer a second round tender to Ivan Pace Jr., which means they'll offer him a contract worth about $5.5 million for 1 year. And if another team wants to sign him, they would have to agree to a contract with him, and then they would have to give the Minnesota Vikings a second round pick. So if you want to go after Ivan Pace Jr., you're going to have to pay him more than $5.5 million per year, at least for the year. And you're going to do more than a year because you're not going to give up a second round pick for a 1 year contract. But then you're also going to have to give the Minnesota Vikings a second round pick. Of course, you probably know this. If you don't, the Washington Commanders don't have a second round pick. So they would have to first go get a second round pick. Then they'd have to agree to a contract with Ivan Pace Jr. That's more than $5.5 million per year. And, oh, by the way, the Minnesota Vikings would still have the opportunity to match the contract, and it all goes away anyway. So, again, it would be interesting to have the conversation, but at the end of the day, the Minnesota Vikings aren't going to let Ivan Pace out the door any faster than they're going to let Jalen Redmond out the door. Now, one player that they could let out the door who would probably not spur a whole lot of excitement from the fan base, but would be a very important part of, again, that installation process for Daronte Jones and his defense is veteran cornerback Jeff Okuda. This is a buy low scenario for the Washington Commanders on a former top 3 pick. He's a press man type of corner, fits the profile of a physical corner, has the length and all that stuff that Daronte Jones has typically used in his secondaries, which is no dub because Jeff Okuda has been in Daronte Jones secondary for the last 2 years. So obviously he fits the profile of what they're looking at. Only played 93 snaps in 6 games before he was injured for the rest of the season, placed on injured reserve. But in those 93 snaps, in those 6 games, he was getting some rotational work with basically, starter type reps, rotational starter type reps, starter type upside. So obviously there was at least some confidence in his ability on the field, but also, again, he knows the language, he knows the system, he knows what Daronte Jones is going to bring, what he's going to expect. He can come into that cornerback room just like Eric Wilson come into the linebacker room, and whether he ends up being a starter or a rotational player or not, he's at a minimum going to help that team install their system in training camp and during the offseason program and all that kind of stuff. Also, there's an interesting connection between Okuda and the Commanders. Okuda and David Blau, new Washington Commanders offensive coordinator, were teammates with the Detroit Lions from 2020 to 2022. So David Blau could obviously speak to Jeff Okuda's character just like Daronte Jones could. So if both of them vouch for his locker room fit, his character, again, he can help install the system. He can help accelerate the learning curve of the system. So to me, I think you absolutely at least have the cup of coffee, have the conversation, or at least you ask David Blau and Daronte Jones, or Daronte is going to present him either way. If he wants him, you put him on there on a prove it deal, 1 year, $2.5 to $4 million, heavily incentive based, those types of things. You're really not paying a whole lot for a guy like Jeff Okuda. But if he can help your secondary and your cornerback room specifically get up to speed faster, especially guys like Trey Amos, Mikey Sanderstill, who are going to be learning their second defensive systems in the NFL since joining the NFL, he's going to be worth every single penny that you pay him. So the big fish are always exciting, but when you have to pull the little fish on the field, you really need to be sure that you're putting the right ones out there. So we're going to dive into why TavierreThomas could join this roster from Minnesota in the coming months. That coming up next on today's episode of Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Commanders brought to you in part by Indeed. If you've ever hired someone who looked good on paper, but just wasn't the right fit in person, you know how important it is to get that right. And when you want candidates who truly match what you're looking for, you need to trust Indeed sponsored jobs. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. If I need to hire someone to help me with Locked On Commanders, I would go straight to Indeed, be very specific about what I need, and look for real experience, not just resume buzzwords. Instead of struggling to get the job post seen, Indeed sponsored jobs would help me list my standing and get that posting standing out and reach quality candidates faster. Sponsored jobs boost your post to the people who are best matched for the role and makes a real difference. Spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Listeners of this show get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Again, that's Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now, and support the show by telling them that you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Do it the right way with Indeed. Talking about Minnesota Vikings pending free agents that the Washington Commanders should target now that Daronte Jones has arrived. Talked about a veteran linebacker, talked about a little bit younger wide receiver, talked about some other players. Now let's talk about some guys who would be considered the bottom of the roster, back end of the roster, but could still provide some importance and some significance, starting with safety TavierreThomas. We talked about the Joshua Metellus role in the Daronte Jones defense. And some of you have mentioned Caleb Downs as being a guy that could be of important safety, but it's not the same type of role. And that type of role would be more like a Quan Martin or a Jeremy Reeves. Well, in Minnesota, TavierreThomas was kind of that backup to Metellus, and that's exactly what you would sign him in Washington to be. 1 year vet minimum. You're talking about $1.2 million. You could probably get him. Again, Minnesota might want to bring him back as well. In Minnesota, you might say, listen, there's no Jeremy Reeves for me to compete with. There's just me. I'm the backup guy out there, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come back. So it would be kind of a coin toss, but I think the Washington Commanders would be wise to at least go out there and have the conversation. And again, if you get him, you're getting a guy who's been in the system, knows the language, can help out. The next name we're going to bring up, very interesting name, Fabian Moreau. If you've been a Washington Commanders fan for longer than I've been covering this team, you know who Fabian Moreau is. Very competent veteran depth piece. Obviously, there's a franchise familiarity, although the franchise is vastly different than when he was here. Raises the floor of the room, cornerback 3 ceiling, most likely cornerback 4 type of guy. Was one of the first guys off the bench in Minnesota. Again, trusted like Okuda, and actually got a few more reps than Okuda did, even when they were both healthy. So again, he's a guy that you can probably go get. He's a veteran, knows the system, knows the language. 1 year, $1.5 to $2 million is probably what you're looking for there. And the final pending defensive free agent from the Minnesota Vikings roster right now for 2026 is edge rusher Bo Richter. Truthfully, don't have a lot of footage on him. Don't know a lot about him. He's exclusive rights free agent. So again, the Washington Commanders will likely never even see him. The Minnesota Vikings have no reason unless they just don't like him. And if they don't like him, to bring him back on a minimum contract, that's a pretty big red flag for the rest of the league. And if the Minnesota Vikings don't want him, the coach who just came from that organization probably doesn't want him either. So I don't think there's anybody pounding the table per se for Bo Richter to come to Washington. And I don't think that it's going to happen anyway. So that's going to do it for today's episode. Looking at pending Minnesota Vikings defensive free agents and wide receiver Jalen Nailor. I threw that in there, just a little bit bonus for you. I know we were supposed to talk about Senior Bowl practice standouts, but it kind of dawned on me that we haven't talked about Minnesota Vikings free agents that the Commanders could target. So I decided to call an audible, and that's what we pivoted to today. So on the next episode, we will talk about the Senior Bowl. Make sure you are subscribed. Follow along with Locked On Commanders so you get all the latest episodes. And you can follow me on X at DHarrison82, on Instagram at DHarrison_82. And if you never miss an episode, that means you're an everydayer, and the Everydayer Club is literally built for you. LockedOnCommanders.supercast.com to check that out today. For your next listen of the day, check out the Locked On NFL podcast twice per day, once in the morning, once in the afternoon, giving you the bird's eye view of the National Football League. And to the everydayers, I see you. I appreciate you every single day. And I thank you for coming through yet again today. Until next time, please stay safe, be kind to one another. We'll talk again real soon right here on Locked On Commanders, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.